everybody, and welcome to another episode of Adventures with Andy. It's time for the May 2021 Dye Along with ChemKnits, and our inspiration photo this month is this gorgeous picture of a blue jay. Okay, now those of you who are experiencing a little bit of deja vu here, don't worry, you have not clicked on the wrong video. I didn't upload the wrong video. You didn't get stuck in some sort of Groundhog Day-esque time loop. Because now that we have done our experiment to sort of hone in on how we want to dye our gray yarn, we are actually going to dye our Blue Jay inspired gradient today. I have a ton of stuff here in front of me, even more than I did for our gray yarn dyeing experiment, because we're going to dye a total of 11 skeins of yarn today, mini skeins. We're dyeing the same yarn that we did for our gray experiment. That is the Dyer Supplier 7525 Superwash Merino Nylon fingering weight yarn. And right here, I have divided 2 skeins of that yarn into, we're going to call it 20 gram mini skeins, but as we know, my scale has its own view of reality, and those numbers can change from one way into the next. But so we're going to hope that that's right. And of course, we have the one in here that's left over from our gray yarn dyeing experiment, which is about 15 grams-ish. I also have notes. I spent a lot of time today researching and figuring out calculations for how we want to dye this. We're going to be doing 3 color gradients in this. The first one obviously is the gray, which is what we worked on last time. We're also going to do one in royal blue, and we're going to do one in teal. Now, in addition to our Wilton's black color corrected with yellow to make our gray, we're also going to be working with Wilton's royal blue and Wilton's teal for our blue portion of the gradient. I'm actually going to approximate a 1% stock solution. A 1% stock solution is 1 gram of dye to 100 milliliters of water. Now, normally you would be mixing this from dye powder, but we are using Wilton's Icing gel, which contains more than just the food color dye. It's got glycerin and citric acid and corn syrup and all kinds of other stuff. I don't know what else. And I don't know what the percentage of dye to other ingredients is for each of these. So I don't know the exact gram per any measurement of dye that we're going to get. The other issue that we run into is I really can't measure this out in grams because, as we know, my scale has its own view of reality, and it's not exactly trustworthy to tell me that what I measure out is a gram. Plus, it does not seem to want to register anything less than 6 grams, and I don't necessarily need more than 6 grams. I just simply don't trust it to give me an accurate measurement. So we're going to be using teaspoons for this. One of the things I looked up today is how many grams are in a teaspoon. 1 teaspoon is roughly 4.2 grams, and that usually apparently gets rounded down to 4 grams. So 5 grams is 1.18 teaspoons. 1 liter of water is, of course, 1,000 milliliters, because metric makes sense in a way that imperial does not. And 4 cups of liquid equals 1 liter, or 1,000 milliliters. So we are going to be making dye stocks with 500 milliliters of water today, which is 2 cups. My equation here, bearing in mind I am not a math person, I am a writer, I know words, I do not know numbers, is 2 cups of water plus 1 1/4 teaspoons of dye is going to give us our 1%-ish stock solution. From there, we get to work with depth of shade. So for a 1% depth of shade, that's just a baseline from a 1% stock solution. It is a 1-to-1 ratio. 1 milliliter of dye to 1 gram of yarn. So if we wanted to do a 1% depth of shade on 20 grams of yarn, like our mini skeins are, we would need 20 milliliters of dye. For a 2% depth of shade, which is going to be a darker color, we need to double that. So for a 20 gram mini skein of yarn, we would need 40 milliliters of dye. And again, for a 3% depth of shade, that would go up to 60 milliliters. For a 0.5% depth of shade, which is lighter than the baseline 1% dye stock, you just cut it in half. So for a 20 gram mini skein, we would only use 10 milliliters. Starting with our teal, we're going to do 3%, 2%, 1% depth of shade. And then we're going to start mixing it with the royal blue so that we have 1% of the teal and a 0.5% depth of shade of the royal blue. And then we'll flip that so we have 1% of the royal blue and a 0.5% of the teal, and then 1% of just the royal blue, 2% depth of shade of the royal blue, 3% depth of shade of the royal blue. You may notice that the blues we're doing in mason jars, we're going to end up with some semi-solid tonal. They're not going to be straight solid because, as you know, it's not going to have enough room for the yarn to move around. And I'm fine with that because we're going to be doing a gradient. Those will blend together, and because the Bluejay's feathers, the blue in them, is not just a solid streak of blue. The grays, we want them to be more consistent. We don't want it to have, be all packed in like that, because we know that that Wilton's black will break and we'll end up not getting gray. We'll end up getting purple or green when we color correct, yellow. We saw this last video. If you haven't seen the last adventure, you can go back and watch that one and see. So we want to give them a lot more room to move than what they're going to get in a mason jar. We're going to be using the crock pot for one. We're going to be using the plastic tub for another one. And because I just don't have any other large containers to dye with, we're going to be using this aluminum roasting pan for the third one. We're only going to be doing 3 skeins of the gray. And we don't want this to go too dark because then we start moving into black instead of gray. So instead of doing a 1, 2, and 3% like we're doing with our blues, we're going to do a 0.5% depth of shade for one of the grays, a 1% depth of shade for the second one, and a 2% depth of shade for the third one, which will hopefully get us a nice gradient between a really light pale gray and a darker gray, kind of bordering on black, sort of like what we see in the darker stripes in the Bluejay's feathers. All right, to start with, I'm going to mix up the teal blue. Chad has very kindly filled this jar up to the 1/4 cup mark with hot tap water. I'm going to start with that because that will be easier to mix, and then we'll go ahead and fill it up the rest of the way. Okay, that's 1/4 teaspoon. And honestly, y'all, I don't know if I have 1 1/4 teaspoons of this. This is really concentrated dye, so we'll do what we can. A 1/2 teaspoon. Three-quarters. It's art, not science. Art, not science. Mixed a little bit of hot water in this little container to get out the rest of what I could. And that is all she wrote, folks. That's it for the teal. We're going to have to call that close enough to our 1 1/4 teaspoon. 1.5 cups of cold water. These particular mason jars are awesome because they have the measurements on the side. New jar! Dear Wiltons, please put little tabs to make it easier to open your jars. All right, so I need 1 1/4 teaspoon of the royal blue. Okay, now that our dye stocks are all mixed up, we can go ahead and start aliquoting out into our mason jars. We're going to start with the 3% teal, which is going to get 60 milliliters of our dye stock. 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Next up, our 2%, which is going to get 40 milliliters. 4 is 40. And now our 1% depth of shade teal, which is going to be 20 milliliters. And then our first teal blue mix, which is going to be 1% teal, so 20 milliliters. 1, 2, and we will have to add the blue in a second. And now our second blue teal mix, which is going to have a 0.5% depth of shade for the teal, which is just 10 milliliters. 1. And we still have quite a lot of dye left. That's pretty awesome. And now for our royal blue. First up is our teal blue mix that's going to get the 0.5% depth of shade of the royal blue. So that is just 10 little milliliters. And next up is our next blue teal mix, which is going to have the 1% depth of shade of the royal blue. So it's going to get 20 milliliters. And now our 1% royal blue, which is also getting 20 milliliters. Our 2% royal blue, which will get 40. And our 3% depth of shade of the royal blue, which is going to get 60 milliliters. And that is our full range of our blue gradient. Now I do want to go ahead and mix up the blue teal mixes just to make sure that those two colors are incorporated fully. And I'm not going to worry about rinsing off the stir between them because it's such a minor amount of dye that's going to be on there that it's not going to be a problem. And now, finally, at long last, we can actually put our yarn in our jars. Now, these have been soaking in just plain room temperature tap water while we've been doing all this mixing. And each of these skeins also has a different color or color combination of silicone zip ties so that I can tell them apart later when I'm washing them. So I'm just going to put it down in there. And then fill the jar up the rest of the way. Put the lid on. And it does not actually matter how much additional water I put in each of these jars because our concentration of dye is already set. It's just more or less water only determines how much the yarn can move and how much access it can have for the individual strands to come in contact with the dye. So as long as you put in that percentage, that ratio of dye to yarn, that's your depth of shade, no matter how much water you put it in, no matter the size of your dye bath. Thank you. All right, so now all of our blues are in their dye baths and they're just going to sit here overnight, and I will add vinegar in the morning. We know it's not going to strike. We know the dye bath isn't going to exhaust overnight because it's blue. But we're gonna go ahead and just let this sit overnight in this dye bath, cool that dye it. We'll add the vinegar in the morning. Which leaves us with our 3 skeins for the gray. This will be a little bit faster because our dye is already mixed up. From our last episode, experimenting with dyeing yarn gray with food color. If you haven't seen it, go watch after you finish washing this one. And if you did miss it, that's why you should subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any adventures. All right, our crock pot is going to be our 0.5% gray, which is going to be 10 milliliters of our dye stock. Now this is not necessarily a 1% dye stock. It is just the same dye stock that we used for testing dyeing our gray. It is, again, just Wilton's Icing Gel Black. So 0.5% is going to be 10 milliliters. Give this a quick stir. I think this is the skein that was left over after our last episode. It seems slightly smaller than the others. It's not going to make that big of a deal, but I am going to try putting it in here. And then just put the lid on that. Move this out of the way. Okay, this is going to be our 1% gray. So it's going to get 20 milliliters of our dye stock. 1. I really do think that's just the coolest thing, just watching it spread out in the water. And then last up is our 2% gray, which is going to get 40 milliliters of our dye stock. I don't know if you can see it on camera, but you can actually see the red breaking out. Okay, that seems to be pretty well mixed. Would you care to lower the skein in, Chad?
There you go.
Thank you, sweetie. Okay, now this one does not have a lid, obviously. So we're just going to cover it up with aluminum foil. All right. I guess I will see all of y'all in the morning. Good morning, everyone. I've had my coffee. I've had my oatmeal. Our yarn's been sitting out here in its dye baths all night. And now it's time to add some vinegar so we can get those dye baths to exhaust. I'm going to start by putting 3 teaspoons in each of the mason jars. And then in the larger containers that have the gray dye baths, I'm going to put 6 teaspoons in. Just because it's more water, and again, we're trying to raise the pH level to get the dye to strike. Now we just let everything sit out here and steep. And then we'll come out here later on and we'll add some heat. All right, our blues are all sitting over here in their mason jars. I heat set them last night, but when I just tried rinsing out the 3% royal blue, I had a lot of bleeding. So they're going to just continue to sit here in vinegar while we work on our grays. I did add some more vinegar to everything. So they're just going to continue to sit in their jars while we work on our grays. I will heat set them again later. But for now, let's take a look at, this is our 0.5% gray. And we've got a nice light grayish purple in most places, but we do have a lot of spots where we have a light blue. And as we know from our experiments in the last episode, if I add yellow to this to color correct this purple over to gray, we're going to get a lot of green, and we want to avoid that. So I'm going to go ahead and add another 5 milliliters of our Wilton's black. We originally started with 10 milliliters on this one. I don't want to double it because then that would take us to the same 20 milliliters that our 1% gray skein has. 5 will take us a little bit darker, and hopefully we'll get red striking to those blue spots to get them off of being just blue and coax them more over to the color that we want before we go ahead and color correct this with yellow. And this dye bath, of course, does have vinegar now, so this is going to strike faster than our initial dye bath in it. The water is not hot, but yeah, it's actually cool, which is surprising. Everything else out here, the water is warm because the high today was 84, so it's very hot here in our garage. Not hot enough for our purposes with this though, so I'm going to go ahead and plug in the crock pot and let it come up to temp. That'll give this yarn plenty of time to sit here in a cool dye bath before it starts heating up and taking up and setting that dye. All right, over here we have our 1% gray. As you can see, our dye bath essentially clear. And this skein, which I have not heat set or washed, but as you can see, it is pretty much just a consistent light grayish purple. We've got a few minor areas where there's a strand here or there that's sort of a blue leaning, very pale gray, but not so much that I'm worried about it. So we're going to go ahead and add the yellow dye into this dye bath. In our gray experiment, we did a total of 50 milliliters of yellow, which I think was too much. I think that's why we ended up with a green leaning gray, and I would rather have a lavender or purple leaning gray. So we're going to start with just 10 milliliters of the yellow dye. It's not a lot, but we can always add more if we need to. We cannot take it out once we put it in, and if we go too far, our only recourse to get it back to gray is to put more of the black dye in. And of course, this dye bath also already has vinegar in it. I think this one has a total of 3 tablespoons in now, but I could be wrong because I added more to it off camera last night. So this is going to strike faster, and that's fine. Doesn't have any heat on it, not going to have any heat on it until we finish working with our 0.5% gray and the crock pot's freed up. Right, and last up is our 3% yarn. And our dye bath for this one is almost exhausted. It's just a very faint pale blue, and I've had to put a lot of vinegar in here. Again, I've lost count of how much. But our yarn, as you can see, it's a really dark color. It's not to black yet, it's a dark gray, and remember, it'll be lighter when it dries. We do have some sections that look like they're blue leaning, but nothing like that pale bright blue that we had in our 0.5%. Stop grabbing random things. Oh my God, the yarn. So again, we're going to go ahead and we're going to add our yellow to start color correcting it. Now this one, because we have a darker yarn, I'm going to add more of the yellow dye to than I did to our 1%, but still not a ton. That's 10 and 20. Mix this all throughout and put our yarn in. This one also has had no heat applied to it. It has just taken up this color strictly by being in this cold vat dye bath and the only heat it's had is just from it getting hot here in the garage. I have come out here a few times yesterday and today and just sort of moved the yarn around in the dye bath, all three of the grays, to give them more access. And now we'll just sit here and wait for the crock pot to come up the temperature and let these two just sit here and soak up that dye, and we'll come back and check everything and see if we need to add any more yellow. Checking in on our yarn, our 0.5% here. If we take a look at our dye bath, we've got a faint blue in there. The red has pretty much taken up, and the red is what we were most concerned with because we wanted to even out those blue sections. And looking at our yarn, we've got much less of that bright blue. We do still have some sections in here, some strands where we're seeing blue, but they're now more of a navy blue than that bright blue. So we're gonna go ahead and put some of our yellow dye in the dye bath and go ahead and try to shift that purple more towards just a true gray. If we need to later on, we can go back and either put in some more of the black or put in some red to color correct that blue if it starts to shift green. And start slow with just 10 milliliters of the yellow because we don't want to overdo this and push this over toward green. And go ahead and put our yarn in here. Make sure everything's got plenty of access. Put the lid back on and just let this continue to sit here in the hot water for a while. Okay, looking at our dye bath over here in our 1% gray, the dye bath it's basically exhausted. I know it was really light yellow to start with, but there's pretty much no color in here now. And our yarn is still purple. So we're gonna go ahead and add some more yellow dye in here. And we can go ahead and put our yarn back in here. Spread it around. Now looking over at our 2% gray, you can see we still have color left in this dye bath. It's a very faint green. So we're just gonna leave this here, leave it alone. We're not gonna put any more color in this one yet. This was, of course, the one that took the longest to exhaust the dye bath in the first place because it had so much dye in there, which means it's already taken up a lot of dye. It's gonna take its sweet time taking up any of this. So it's been about 15 minutes and our dye bath has fully exhausted. And if we look at our yarn, it's coming along nicely. We've got some sections that are looking definitely gray, especially the lighter sections, the ones that were more blue are now looking just more gray now. But we still have a lot of it that's reading purple. It's a purple gray, but it's still reading purple. So I'm thinking another 10 milliliters of yellow. There's 10 ml of yellow dye. Go ahead and swirl that around. Put our yarn back in. And it's time for dinner. So I'm going to go ahead and unplug this. The water is very hot. You can see the steam already on the lid of the crock pot. So I'm going to turn this off and just let this sit in the hot steamy water while Chad and I go grab some dinner. And then we'll come back and we'll take a look and see if we need to add any more yellow. Good morning. It is the next day. I have had my oatmeal. I have had some, but not all of my coffee yet. So I might not be as perky and chipper and awake as normal. Our yarn is looking pretty good. Here in the garage, it looks like a nice gray, but when I take it outside and look at it in the sun, I still see a lot of purple tone to it. So another 10 ml of the yellow will take us up to 30 milliliters of the yellow. And we don't want to go much more than that because in our gray experiments, we went up to 50 milliliters, and that's when we ended up with a green leading gray, and we want to avoid that. I'd rather stay a purple leading gray because that's more in line with our inspiration photo. Again, our dye bath is really light yellow, but it is actually making a difference in the yarn each time. I am such a klutz when I haven't had enough coffee. Who am I kidding? I'm such a klutz all the time, aren't I, Chad?
Nah.
Oh, don't you lie to people. Don't you dare. All right, gonna go ahead and plug in the crock pot, turn it up to high, and let this come to heat. And I'm gonna go finish my coffee. So the water in the crock pot is hot. It's not simmering or anything, but it's hot, and our dye bath is exhausted. Also, our yarn is looking pretty good. We did take it out and look at it in the sun. There's still a lot of purple in there, but there's a lot of it that's looking a really, really nice gray. I am going to call it here because I don't want to risk this shifting over to green, and there's a couple of spots that look like they're starting to lean that way. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and set that one aside, and we're going to start working on our 2% gray. And the reason that we're doing that one instead of the 1% right now is because the 1% is going to take some more work. The first thing I'm going to do is top up this water, this dye bath, with some of the water from the 2% gray dye bath. You can see there's no color in it either. And I'm doing this for a couple of reasons. One, I just want a little bit more room for it to be able to move around in here. The water got really pretty low over time with the last skein. And also because I want this to be not hot for this yarn to go in. It's warm now. I can comfortably put my finger in where before it was not comfortable to put my finger in. Now, unfortunately, I don't remember how much yellow dye I have put in here already. And I haven't started editing this video, so I haven't gone back and looked at the footage to see. I've also checked with Chad. He does not remember either. But I'm going to go ahead on this one and put 20 ml in here because it's a darker color and I think it can handle a little bit more yellow dye, especially considering that it took us 30 ml to get our 0.5% to a good gray. And you can see this is a really, really dark purple color. And we've got some dark blue as well. I'm hoping we get a charcoal gray with this one, and putting it in the heat here will also help these colors to set. Because remember, we haven't used any heat on this one yet. So this has just been cold vat dyeing with a lot of vinegar. Just gonna put the lid on this and let it sit out here for at least 20 minutes. Come out and check and see how the dye bath looks. All right, so this has been out here for about 20-30 minutes. Our dye bath has gotten down to just a very, very pale blue. And our yarn, it's leaning a little purple still, really dark purple. Went out and looked at it in the sunlight. If it sounds like I'm huffing and puffing, it's because I've been mowing the yard and I'm on the hill section, so I've been doing hill climbs for the past half hour. So we are gonna go ahead and add another 10 milliliters of yellow. And I'm gonna go finish mowing the yard. while this steeps for another 20 to 30 minutes. Okay, so our dye bath is down to just a faint blue tinge, but checking the yarn itself, and again I took it out into the sun to look at it there where we can get a more true read on it. We got a lot of it that is looking gray, but we still have a really dark purpley to quite a bit of it. So we're going to go ahead and put another 10 ml of yellow in here. Swirl this around. Put our yarn back in. And since I've now finished, well, okay, Chad helped. Since we've now finished mowing the yard, we're gonna go have some lunch while we let this sit for another half hour or so. So our dye bath has exhausted and our yarn is looking really good. We've got a lot of it that looks just a really nice gray. We've got some that still has lots of purple tones in it, but we also have some places that are starting to get a yellow tone to them. So I don't want to push this by adding any more yellow. So we're going to go ahead and take this one out and start working on our 1% gray. Now, as you can see, it's dye bath also exhausted, but it is decidedly pinky purple. We don't have gray here yet, not even close. And again, just like with our 2% gray, I don't remember how much yellow I put in before. So we're going to start by adding 10 milliliters right here. And the water is hot. I did unplug the crock pot while we took a break for lunch. But I'll plug it back in now. Got our dye bath. Got that yellow to it again. So we know we got some good color in there. Put our yarn in here. I added another little splash of vinegar when our 2% gray was in here. So we should have a good amount of acid in here, but we can always add more if we need to. Put the lid on here before I knock it over. And we'll come back and check on this in about 20 minutes. It's been about 15 minutes. Our dye bath is clear, but our yarn has still got a lot of pinky purple to it. We've had a lot of sections that are starting to look a really nice gray, but quite a bit of it is still looking pinky purple. Not lavender, just pinky purple. So we're going to go in with another 10 ml of our yellow. And I do, of course, still have plenty of the black if I have to color correct this one with some black because of that pinkness. I could also, if necessary, mix in some blue. But for now, we're just going to go ahead and put it back in here. The water is very, very hot. Not boiling, not simmering, but definitely hot. Let it sit for another 15 minutes. All right, our dye bath is exhausted again, and our yarn is starting to look more gray. We still have quite a bit of the pinky purple though, so we're going to add another 10 milliliters of yellow in. Now this is probably the last time I'm going to do some yellow without at least doing some more black or possibly some blue, because we're starting to get a yellow haze around some of the strands of yarn at this point, and I don't want to shift it too far yellow. And our water is nice and hot in there, so I'm going to go ahead and unplug the crock pot and let it just sit in the hot water for a while. Plus I also need to go to the store and run an errand. So we will be back and check in on this in a little bit. Back from our errands, and our dye bath has exhausted. Our yarn's looking a lot better. We've got some sections that look just like a fantastic gray. And again, took this outside, looked at it in the sunlight, in the natural light, and yeah, there's some sections that look just perfect, but there's still a lot of that pinky purple in there. So I'm gonna go ahead and put another 10 milliliters of yellow in here, and depending on how it looks after this, I might actually have to put some blue in. Water is still warm. I'm gonna let it sit without turning the heat back on and come back out, check on this in about 20 minutes. Our dye bath has completely cleared and our yarn is actually looking really good. We've got some areas that still have that pinkish purple to them, but most of it has got just a really nice gray shade to it. So we're gonna call this one done for now. Obviously reserving the right to come back and color correct some more later. Now that our grays are done, we're gonna start working on heat setting our blues. They got heat set before in their mason jars, but this one just had so much bleeding to it. I just want to heat set all of these just to make sure that we're not gonna have a big bleeding problem. I'm gonna put some more vinegar in here. 2, 3 tablespoons. And I'm gonna put this yarn together with its dye bath here in the crock pot. I am also going to be putting this yarn mop in here. And the reason I'm using this one is because our original yarn mop has a lot of color in it already. I've washed it and there was no bleeding and it is hanging up drying. But I don't want to risk putting it in here with these yarns and having some of the non-blue colors backstain onto these. So we're going to put this yarn mop in here. We're going to turn the crock pot on and let it sit for at least 20 to 30 minutes. Well, I am definitely glad that I did this, because check out the color of our yarn mop. We picked up a lot of blue. I mean, there's still a little white on it in places, but yeah, we definitely picked up some color from this skein of yarn. Dye bath is clear. I'm gonna scoop out some of this. Whew. Yeah, that's hot water. Let it sit and soak here overnight while we switch over to the next skein. And it's going to be tougher to tell this time how much color we get out of it, because our yarn mop is already got a lot of color in it, but it's okay. And this skein's not been washed. The only one that I did any washing on was the 3%. This is just gonna sit here all night like this. I'll do the rest of them in the morning because it's pretty late now. And we're back. I washed and hung up everything to dry. And right now everything looks really good except this skein. This is our middle skein of gray, and for some reason it is brown. I don't know why. I've looked at it out here. I've looked at it up in my office. I've taken it out into natural sunlight, which gives a truer feel for what the colors look like. And yeah, this one's definitely brown. So we're gonna go ahead and try to color correct that over to gray by putting it in with another 10 milliliters of black. Right now this water is cold. This is actually some of the leftover dye bath water from the 2 cold bathtubs, and I added another 2 tablespoons of vinegar to it. It should still have been plenty acidic, but I just want to make sure that all of this color takes up. Okay, so there's our 10 milliliter. The yarn is actually dry. Normally I would like to soak this first, but I wanted to show you what it looked like dry. All right, lid on, crock pot is turned on, set to high. It's gonna take quite a while to heat up because this water is cold, but then I will come back out here and we'll see if we need to add any more if we're happy with where it is. And here, at long last, after a marathon week of dyeing, is our finished gradient yarn. I think this turned out so good. I love how the colors move from the dark blue all the way through into the dark teal. And I am so happy with how these grays turned out. We did get some breaking, which we sort of expected. If you look here at the 3% royal blue, we've got some purple areas, some lighter blue in here. It's even more apparent in like this skein here, where you see lots of lighter sections, some darker sections, more of that pink breaking. But we knew that was going to happen, not only because it's food coloring and it's really, really hard to get a solid skein, but also because we had them in the mason jars and they just didn't have enough room for everything to move around and have equal access to the dye. We got much less breaking over here on the teal side. No breaking at all, really, to be honest. And again, like our royal blue, we've got very apparent here in our 1% teal, a lot of lighter patches, darker patches from it just not having as much room to move around. You may notice that I made a slight error in calculations when I planned this. This was supposed to go dark, shifting to lighter royal blue, then blending into the lighter teal and on up into the darker teal. And it does not do that. We have the dark royal blue shifting on down into the lighter royal blue, then picking up to a slightly darker color, but basically the same, and then a darker teal, and then into this really light teal, moving back on up into our darker teal. And that is because these two skeins here are the skeins where we mix the royal blue and the teal together. This one is 1% royal blue and 0.5% teal. This one is 1% teal, 0.5% royal blue. This skein is 1% teal. This skein is 1% royal blue. These each have a 1% depth of shade. These two have a 1.5% depth of shade. And that was just a mistake on my part, which does go to show you how depth of shade works. If I were to dye this gradient again, these two middle skeins, I would either do one skein that's half and half or do them 0.75% one color, 0.25% the other color to come up with a 1% that is equal to the ones on the other side of it, or possibly 0.5%, 0.25%, so that they're slightly lighter than that. Okay, so let's take a minute here and talk about our gray. Now, if you remember, we said that dyeing gray yarn with food coloring is really hard. As hard, if not harder, than dyeing black, because black food coloring breaks. And that is very apparent here in our 0.5% skein. If you look at it, you can see some more blue sections, more purple sections. They're incredibly subtle though. And overall, it is a gorgeous light dove gray. On our 3%, we see pretty much the same as well. We've got some sections that are sort of a navy blue, some other sections that are a little bit dark purple, but overall the majority of the strands are just a solid charcoal gray. And when it's worked up, it's going to blend together gorgeously. I actually think these two work perfectly for our inspiration photo. Here in the middle, we have our 1% skein. And this is the one that gave us the most trouble, the one that we had to keep going back and color correcting because it was that pinky purple. Well, then at one point it was brown. And I know in this light it still reads maybe a little brown, maybe a little reddish. If you look at it in natural daylight, it actually is a purple leaning gray, which is exactly what I wanted. But what I found really interesting is, if you remember, we had one skein that was left over from last episode where we first tried out dyeing the yarn gray to figure out exactly how we wanted to do it, what method. Those skeins were not 20 grams, they were smaller, averaging about 15 grams. And I did not think it had enough to label the one that was smaller so I could choose which dye bath I wanted to put it in. I was hoping to make it this one since the 0.5% would have less dye to take up. Turns out it's this one. This is our skinny skein. And I have to wonder if the fact that it was less yarn taking up that amount of dye is why we had all the trouble with it continuing to read that pinky purple. I'd be interested to go back sometime and try dyeing a 20-gram skein with 1% of this dye stock, which I do have plenty of it left still, just to see if we still have that red tone to it, or if, like these two, they come out with more of a bluish purple tone. All in all, though, I am absolutely thrilled to have gotten this level of gray with food coloring. And of course, we can't forget our yarn mops. This is the first one that we used, which has been in other videos, and we just wiped up lots of excess dye that I spilled everywhere. That's what I do. And it is such a pretty mix of colors. This is our big full 100-gram skein that we used when we were heat setting all the blues. And it's picked up a nice amount of color. We still have a lot of areas that have no dye in them whatsoever. It's a really pretty pale blue mixed with white, and it would knit up into something really lovely. But I'm probably going to keep on using this as a yarn mop for a little bit more, because it can still take up plenty more dye. I hope you had fun watching me dye this Bluejay inspired gradient mini skein set, and I hope it shed a little light for you on how changing the amount of dye that you're using based on how much yarn you have can affect the shade of color that you get on your finished skeins. If you did enjoy the video, please make sure to hit the like button, and if you haven't already subscribed, go ahead and do that so you don't miss anything that we try here. You have a wonderful day, and I will see you on our next adventure. Bye!